Charles Freeman was previously Assistant U.S. Trade Rep for China Affairs, and Charles is currently Chair of China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and he joins us from our D.C. Bureau. A good Monday evening to you, Charles. So let's talk about this. Wen's declaration really, do you think, just a public stance here against the U.S.? He really doesn't want to bow to U.S. pressure and really lose face.
Well, that's a big part of it. That China has politics just like the United States does, and its politics are increasingly populist, and there's a big swath of angry Chinese youth that's active on the internet that's talking about the need to stand up to U.S. pressure, and so one feeling that pressure has to stand up, and so stand up he has.
And do you think Premier Wen really doesn't think that the yuan is undervalued?
I think it would be he'd be hard pressed to find really in his private moments to suggest that the renminbi is not undervalued, but there are those who make that claim. I think the bottom line is he both wants to send a political message to Washington that he's not going to move and the renminbi is not going to move if just because of U.S. pressure, but also trying to discourage speculators from making the easy bet that they're going to gain 5 to 7% over the next 12 months just by dumping money into renminbi.
Yeah, and Charles, let me just ask you, it seems like these actions by U.S. politicians are reminiscent of what we saw back in 2007 with the Schumer and also the other sort of bill that they wanted to propose on the Chinese currency. But why now? Why are U.S. politicians standing up and saying China has to do something about this?
Well, it's deja vu all over again. I think part of it is that we're in an election cycle here in Washington, and the link between trade, jobs, and Chinese currency has been very expressed for a while, at least in the minds of those running for office on Capitol Hill. And I think that's a big part of it. The other part is that a lot of people in Washington and around the world think that the Chinese have already made the decision to move the renminbi in the right direction, notwithstanding Wen Jiabao's remarks, and that you can gain some easy political victories by saying, hey, we stood up the Chinese, we told them to move the renminbi, and the renminbi moved. So perhaps there are some that are just getting into the game of betting that they'll be right and gain some political victories along the way.
Now, Charles, 130 U.S. lawmakers have signed this letter to Tim Geithner at the U.S. Treasury to label China a currency manipulator. What exactly do they gain by doing that? Don't they have to actually engage the country once they do slap that label?
Well, yeah, naming China manipulator would start a process which ultimately is pretty weak-kneed and doesn't have a lot of teeth to it. Eventually throws things to the IMF, and the IMF, as we all know, is a consensus-driven body, and China has essentially a veto of whatever they do. So the process of naming China manipulator for political purposes is one that doesn't have a lot of utility, and so therefore it's you can feel free to name China manipulator at least within the context of U.S. Politics without much accountability. The markets are a different story, but sometimes when you're trying to run for office, you don't care as much about the markets as you do your constituents back home.
Now, Charles, what I find interesting is you're trying to merge the two, the debate over the Chinese currency and the debate over healthcare reform into one. You said that if they do pass healthcare, then they won't be focusing on the yuan. But if they, how does that work? Maybe you can explain this theory.
Well, no, what I think is that this debate is already very politicized, and those that worry about passage of a health care bill, which I know is supposed to be passed before the president leaves for Indonesia on March 21st, but those that worry about the passage of a big domestic piece of legislation aren't going to care too much if one or two senators say the price for our vote on health care is essentially that you name China currency manipulator. If that happens, then I think that Treasury will be under enormous pressure from parts of the White House to go ahead and dump that name on China, and so it's a political game. It's being played here. It's being played there. I'm not sure who's the victor and who benefits, but there you go.
Yeah, and Charles, one more question for you. If, let's say the U.S. Treasury does label China a currency manipulator, what sort of retaliation do you think the Chinese could take? I mean, aren't they one of the largest U.S. debt holders in the world? In fact, actually, I think Japan overtook them last month. But in terms of broadly, in aggregate, I think they're still number one.
They're big. They hold about 7% of U.S. debt, which is doesn't necessarily make them America's banker, but it makes them a pretty sizable creditor, and what they do determines what a lot of other players in the marketplace will do. So, yes, if they decide to only go short-term on purchasing of short-term debt or agencies, then that means longer-term debt has a higher price. That means for things like agency debt, which is at 10-year agency debt, which is what U.S. mortgages are keyed off of, will be more expensive, which means mortgages will be more expensive, which means more foreclosures are likely, which starts a vicious cycle. So there's a reason to be concerned about pushing the Chinese into a position where they're nervous about the long-term viability of the dollar.
All right, Charles, thank you so much for your time today. Charles Freeman, Chair of China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.